After studying this module, you will be able to 1. Understand the concept of land reform, 2. Analyze the rationale behind land reforms, 3. Appreciate the significance of land reforms in India, 4. Understand status of land reforms in India, 5. Analyze the causes and effects of land reforms in India, and lastly, appreciate why land reforms in India are still an unfinished agenda. Let us now begin with understanding the concept of land reform. Land tenure system is the most vital institution which governs the use of land for any agriculture related economically productive pursuit. It relates to two aspects. Firstly, the traditional or legal rights an individuals or a group of individuals have on land, and secondly, the social relationships among the rural population that emerges from such land rights. In simple words, land reforms mean change in land tenure system. Broadly speaking, land reform involves the fluctuations of laws, regulations or customs concerning regulation of ownership, operation, leasing, sales and inheritance of land. The standard feature of all land reforms, however, is alteration or replacement of current institutional arrangements governing ownership and use of land. In India's concept, it involves not just replacing the older institutional arrangements, that is the zamindari system, but also reorganization of land holdings along with reform of ownership or tenurial rights. In the process of abolition of the zamindari system, imposition of land ceiling and redistribution of surplus land and redefining ownership rights are all important constituents. Next, we will learn about the rationale behind land reforms. To analyze common dispute in favor of redistribution, not essentially redistribution in kind, that is land, one needs to analyze the economic forces that govern the allocation of land. We begin with two empirical regularities. Mainly, small farms are likely to be more productive than large farms. This inverse farm size productivity connection is extensively documented by Banerjee in 1999. Another empirical consistency is that owner cultivated plots of land are likely to be more productive than the one under sharecropping tenancy, according to Shabnam analysis in 1987. Given these observations, one could make an argument in favor of land reforms based on efficiency consideration over and above equity. For example, the inverse relationship between farm size and productivity advises that land reform could increase productivity by bifurcating less productive large farms into numerous more productive small farms. This implies that distribution of a large tract of land will add to agricultural output if it is divided among a number of farmers than when retained by a single farmer. Also, lower productivity underneath sharecropping proposes that land reforms could advance productivity by altering sharecroppers into owner cultivators. For example, if a small farmer is more productive and a large farmer less productive, then the latter would be better off renting some land to the former. Likewise, if sharecropping is unproductive relative to owner cultivation, a landlord must sell the land to the sharecropper to make him an owner cultivator and get a share of the resulting productivity gains. For the sake of larger agriculture production, a piece of land, large or small, need to be used by an owner cultivator, and a large piece of land need to be divided among owner cultivators rather than being used by a single owner cultivator. A land tenure system must ensure production of small tracts of land by owner cultivators to generate maximum productivity. If this is not taking place, the answer lies in some frictions in the operation of land market or some other input relevant for agriculture production. It could be that the land market is operating in a way leading to productivity losses in agriculture. This implies that owner cultivator arrangement subsumes that leasing arrangement to the smaller farmer. There exists a perverse incentive to increase in agriculture output in both cases relating to large scale cultivation by an owner and cultivation by a tenant. While a large landowner uses hired labor which has a lower incentive to put in extra or even the needed effort. This is because he is not going to benefit from his extra effort due to a fixed wage contract with the owner. He may not even work as hard as he should to justify his wage. This is an example of a typical principal agent problem where there is a need to monitoring of the agent by the principal, which is costly. In the same way, a sharecropper efficiently encounters an income tax of 50% in the absence of tenancy legislation being 50:50 and certainly puts in a smaller amount of effort. However, it may be shown that it is not possible to get rid of the incentive problem by designing an appropriate contract leading to state intervention by bringing in new regulations related to ownership and use of land. Apart from perverse incentives, there exists an issue relating to difficulty in monitoring. Some inputs, for instance, effort, care and maintenance of land are intrinsically difficult to monitor. Therefore, unless the party that is providing these inputs are full residual applicants, that is, maintain 100% of the profits, they will undersupply these inputs, resulting in lower production. Such a contract may be offered by the owner when he offers the land permanently for a price or temporarily for an amount of annual rent. Thus, it might not be in the landlord's interest to ensure so. However, such a scenario in which the landowner gets a fixed price once for all or annually will produce an efficient contractual arrangement. Given the scarcity of land, the landlord would like to sell his land at a price which cannot be paid by the tenants due to their acute poverty. Neither they will be capable to pay this rent upfront or guarantee to pay it regardless of whether the output is high or low. He may be able to pay a guaranteed fixed rent of an amount much less than asked by the landowner. It is in the landlord's interest then to request for a share of output despite the fact that it would decrease effort since he gets a greater expected rent. An alternative form of friction that can explain these facts is that due to an imperfect legal system, the market for land does not operate well. Leasing out land involves a risk that it may be tough to remove the tenant if the landlord desires to withdraw land for owner cultivation in future. It appears that incentive problems and imperfect property rights can explain the persistence of inefficiency in the land market, which leads to distortion in the land allocation and lower productivity. The optimal arrangement appears to consist in the owner cultivator arrangement or land to the tiller. Hence, one is led to conclude that land reform will raise productivity as well as assist the goal of equity. It is argued that one does not require full-scale land reforms in order to obtain positive productivity effects. Any strategy that reduces the capability of landowners to extract rents will increase efficacy even if they fall short of land reforms. These consist of policies that upsurge the wealth or income of the rural poor or their negotiating power vis-a-vis the landowners. Though some of these approaches, such as regulation of tenancy, may have a negative influence from the opinion of decreasing the inducement of landowners to lease out land. To sum up, a policy of direct intervention of the state in the land allocation can be rationalized on the basis of imperfect property rights and thin market for land sales and rental. This would typically require a mixture of redefining property rights in land and redistribution of land in favor of the tiller. Reorganizing property rights imply validation of land records and legal protection of ownership rights. Redistribution of land means redistributing surplus land after specifying a land ceiling. Let us now study the significance of reforms in India. In India, there are both economic and political reasons for land reforms. These include land scarcity reflected in high man-land ratio, prevalence of agriculture in rural India, large mass of rural population living below poverty line, and an unequal allocation of land. In this context, it acknowledged main concern on the policy outline after independence when India passed a significant body of land reform legislation. Some evidence in this regard from the other countries is presented to highlight the significance of land reforms. Land reform is particularly popular as component of decolonization struggles in Africa and the Arab land, where it was part of the program for African socialism and Arab nationalism. Cuba has witnessed one of the most comprehensive agrarian reforms in LA. Land reform was a significant measure in attaining economic development in many third world economies in the post-World War II phase, particularly in the East Asian tigers and tiger cubs, nations such as Taiwan, South Korea and Malaysia. Further, we discuss the status of land reforms in India. In India, land reforms may be grouped under four dominant categories. 1. Abolition of zamindari, that is intermediaries, erstwhile rent collectors under the pre-independence land revenue system. 2. Tenancy regulations, that is designed to enhance the contractual terms encountered by tenants relating to crop shares and security of tenure. 3. A ceiling on land holdings, that is with the objective of redistribution of surplus land to the landless. And lastly, steps to combine unequal land holdings. Elimination of intermediaries is usually agreed to be one element of land reform that has been comparatively effective. The achievement in terms of the other components is diverse and varies across states and over time. A list of significant land reforms acts have been provided in Besley and Burgess 2000. Landowners naturally resisted the implementation of these reforms. They directly used their political influence and used several methods of evasion and coercion. They were found to register their own land under the names of different relatives in order to bypass the ceiling. They shuffled tenants around different plots of land so as to prevent them from acquiring incumbency rights stipulated in the tenancy law. It has been claimed that the success of land reform has been determined by the political will of specific state administrations. The notable achievers being the left-wing administration in Kerala and West Bengal. Next, we analyze the causes and effects of land reforms in India. Context with help of two significant empirical issues. One relates to the influence of land reform on productivity and poverty, and the other one relates to the factors that derive success of land reforms. These are interrelated questions. Clearly, the factors that affect the success of land reforms are also expected to impact productivity and poverty. For instance, if a left-wing administration comes in authority, as it did in Kerala and West Bengal, it will perform land reforms more keenly and also execute further reforms. For example, endowing local governments that may exert a direct effect on productivity and poverty. The task is to segregate the influence of land reforms on productivity and poverty in presence of other factors. Let us start by answering the second question first. What drives the success of land reforms? It is because it is more basic question than the other. After all, cause of a phenomena must precede its effect. Besley and Burgess in 2000 found that political factors had a noteworthy effect on land reforms. Particularly, Congress administrations had an undesirable effect on the passing of land reform legislation, especially tenancy reforms. In contrast to it, left-wing administrations had a significant positive effect. Besley and Burgess used these political variables as tools for their land reform measure to acknowledge the apprehensions that land reform is endogenous and could be driven by factors that also affect the dependent variables of interest. Corning and Robinson in 2005 pursued further the investigation of causes of land reform and observed that after controlling for the other variables together with the state and year effects, the probability of reforms increases when land inequality is higher and where peasants have larger political power. Bardhan and Mukherjee in 2005 studied village level data from West Bengal and found that land reform activity is highest where left wing parties hold a larger number of seats in the state legislature, and interestingly, where they faced greater political competition. Summing up, land reform is distinctly driven by political factors. One important component is the power of left wing parties in the state. We may think of the support for left wing parties as demand for land reform. The supply of land reform appears to depend on the electoral success of left wing parties, along with how tight the electoral competition is. Now we look at the literature which analyzes the impact of land reforms on productivity and poverty, irrespective of political regimes. Besley and Burgess in 2000 used state level data relating to 16 major states of India from 1958 to 1992 to identify the effect of land reform on productivity and poverty. A cumulative variable aggregating the number of legislative reforms to date in any specific state was constructed in the study. They controlled for state and year fixed effects and found that fluctuations in economic policies had a negative and important influence on poverty. According to them, this is due primarily to the tenancy reforms component and land reform, which apparently had a negative effect on agriculture productivity. This suggests an equity efficiency trade-off not in line with the rationale behind land reforms outlined in an earlier section and contradicts the empirical regularities talked of in an earlier section above. Abolition of intermediaries reduced poverty without any effect on productivity. Imposing a ceiling on land holdings did not appear to have had much effect on either poverty or productivity. Land consolidation had a positive effect on productivity without having any effect on poverty. A significant contribution of the study is that it demonstrated varying impact of different aspects of land reform on poverty and productivity. A major limitation of the previous study relates to the use of land reform legislation as the measure of land reform and not its implementation, because there exists acknowledged gap between the two. Indeed, a study by Banerjee, Gertler and Ghatak in 2002 found that tenancy reforms improved agriculture productivity in West Bengal. West Bengal is one of the two states with commendable enactment of land reforms. Within a year of being elected in 1977, the left-wing administration launched Operation Barga, a program intended to apply and impose the long dormant agriculture tenancy laws that controlled rents and security of tenure of the sharecroppers. Underneath these laws, if tenants registered with the Department of Land Revenue, they would be permitted to permanent and inheritable tenure on the land they sharecropped, given that they paid the landlord minimum 25% of output as rent. The authors used two different approaches to estimate the effect of this reform on agriculture productivity. Their first approach is to compare the growth in productivity in West Bengal districts with that in the districts in the neighboring country of Bangladesh, which is very similar in terms of agroclimatic conditions, prevalence of tenancy and agriculture technology. This may lead one to presume technological shocks to agricultural yields to be alike among these two regions. The authors find that even though the rate of adoption of HIV rice was faster in Bangladesh than in West Bengal, the rate of growth in rice productivity was greater in West Bengal. They attribute this difference to the implementation of tenancy reforms. However, the study is not without its problems. The ceteris paribus assumption in the study was questioned on two counts. First, change in the method of data collection relating to agriculture production in West Bengal under the new regime, and secondly, other policy reforms including decentralization of public works program in West Bengal. It is possible that impact of the above may have biased the result in favor of West Bengal. The second approach overcomes the above limitation of the study by analyzing inter-district variation in agriculture productivity. The result of the study is likely to exclude any likely upward bias in the level of agriculture productivity due to fluctuations in the data collection methods. Since it looks at variation in the intensity of enactment of tenancy reform, it is not possible to pick up the influence of other programs. The study utilizes the fact that this reform was implemented in different districts of West Bengal at different rates due to bureaucratic frictions. The authors capture inter-district variations in the rate of implementation of this program in terms of proportion of sharecroppers who were registered under this program and proceed to use it as exogenous changes in the availability of a new contractual regime. Districts that received the program earlier are the treatment districts, and the districts that received it later are the control districts. The resulting changes in productivity are attributed to the reform after controlling for a number of other policy and economic variables. This approach provides similar results and suggested that tenancy reform did have a positive effect on agriculture productivity. To recapitulate, it appears that tenancy reform had a direct and positive effect on tenants who were directly affected by it, but the indirect effects of this reform on the rural land market as a whole are obscure. The studies discussed above could not distinguish between the direct and indirect effects of land reform, pointing out to the relevance of micro level studies in this area. Let us now understand land reforms in India, an unfinished agenda. Draft National Land Reform Policy was put in public domain on 24th July 2013. It is a draft of a bill that the Congress government intended to introduce in the Parliament. The draft needs to be debated widely. It ignores the fact that many states are sitting on the land which has been appropriated from those with more than the ceiling and which has not been distributed to the landlords due to vested interest seeking to preserve the political and economic status quo. The other reality it ignores is that it is very difficult for any government to identify who owns how much land. So it is hard to enforce ceilings or identify the genuinely landless. The fundamental reason is the sorry state of land records. Registration of tenants is fraught with the same difficulties. identifying who is leasing to whom is very difficult for the government or any outsider to the village. Attempts to enforce tenancy registration ends up in driving most tenancy underground. It is resisted vigorously by the owners who tend to be politically more powerful. There exist a number of other areas where lack of profound thinking is noticed in the draft. To deal with these distressed sales, it is suggested that a credit facility for poor landowners in distress be developed without any further details. The other big issue is land acquisition. Setting the compensation amount at 4 times the market price avoids the question of how market price will be assessed based on land records that are based on British time surveys. The ceiling limit on exemptions for religious, education, charitable institutions to a single plot of 15 acres does not seem to be appropriate. It will lead to proliferation of institutions opened under different names to circumvent this regulation. While genuine charitable and educational institutions will be stymied, the important issue of consolidation of land holdings has missed attention in the draft. There is a huge demand from landowners for consolidation as the fragmentation of properties is now widespread, with individual parcels too small to be economically viable. Government can promote consolidation of land by helping owners with fragmented plots to exchange holdings. This is one area where there will be little or no political resistance, as it ends up in a win-win for everyone. Let us now summarize what we have learned in this module. Land reform involves the changing of laws, regulations or customs regarding regulation of ownership, operation, leasing, sales and inheritance of land. 2. It appears that incentive problems and imperfect property rights can explain the persistence of inefficiency in the land market, leading to distortions in the allocation of land resulting in productivity losses. Hence, one is led to conclude that land reform will raise productivity as well as serve the goal of equity. Third, to sum up, a direct intervention in the land allocation method may be rationalized on the basis of 2 imperfect property rights and thin market for land sales and rental. This would typically require a combination of reforming property rights in land and redistribution. Reforming property rights imply formalization of land records and legal protection of ownership rights. Redistribution of land means reallocating surplus land after specifying a land ceiling. Fourthly, land reform legislation in India may be grouped under 4 dominant categories. Elimination of intermediaries is generally agreed to be one component of land reforms that has been comparatively fruitful. The achievements with regard to other constituents is mixed and differs across states and over time. It appears that tenancy reforms had an optimistic influence on tenants, which were directly affected by it, but the indirect effect of these reforms on the rural land market as a whole are obscure. Draft National Land Reform Policy was put in public domain on 24th July 2013. It is a draft of a bill that the then government planned to present in the parliament. There are major limitations of the draft and needs to be debated widely.